Welcome, everyone. I know we have quite a few folks registered for today's session, but I'm going to start and let folks join since we have a lot to cover in the next hour. So I am Priya Barua. I'm Director for Market and Policy Innovation, and I'm excited to welcome you all here on behalf of the Clean Energy Buyers Institute, or CEBI. For those of you that may not be aware of who CEBI is, we are a nonprofit organization focused on solving the toughest market and policy barriers to achieving a customer-driven, carbon-free energy system for all. And at CEBI, we really work in collaboration with customers, solution providers, policymakers, leading philanthropies, and energy market stakeholders to develop insights and solutions that help to solve these barriers. And CEBI, together with the Clean Energy Buyers Association, form the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. So for those of you that may not be familiar with who we are, that's a little bit about who we are. And as most of you are aware, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is starting a process to collect stakeholder input to really understand the needs, scope, and potential approaches to inform updates or additional guidance related to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's corporate standard, Scope 2 guidance, the corporate value chain or Scope 3 standard, and supporting documents. Just want to ask everyone to mute as they arrive, please, because we're getting some background noise. Thank you. So in terms of today's workshop discussion, we'll really be focused on the Scope 2 guidance specifically, and we have 3 key objectives for our discussion. Next slide, please, Kerry. The first is to share CEBI's draft Scope 2 revision recommendations. We've had a series of workshops to date through CEBI's Next Generation Carbon-Free Electricity Procurement Initiative that have fed into these recommendations. And in a short while, my colleague Doug Miller will provide context on that. Our next objective is really to listen to feedback and the insights from all of you in the market to refine some of these recommendations. And then our third objective is to encourage all of you to submit thoughtful comments to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol surveys that have been launched. And we'll touch on that a little bit as well. So for our agenda today, we're going to start with I'm going to start with some general housekeeping for the discussion and provide background on what's happening with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and how this fits into the broader needs in today's current market. My colleague Doug will then provide an overview of CEBI's Next Gen initiative and the linkages with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and outline the process and context for CEBI's recommendations to date and the guiding principles that we're using behind those recommendations. And then we'll spend the bulk of the workshop discussing each of the draft recommendations that we have with all of you for feedback and additional insights. And then we'll just wrap with some next steps. Next slide, Corey. Sorry, that was, this is the agenda that I just walked us through. Next slide. So in terms of our ground rules for today, we ask that you use modified Chatham House rules. So you can say who is here and what was said, but not who said what. We ask that you respect the democracy of time. So please, we do want to hear from you. We want you to participate in this, but please keep your comments brief so that we can really make the most out of the time that we have together. And I encourage all of you to also use the Zoom features that we have. Please, if you can, update your profile with your name and company, and feel free to use the chat function as well. We will be monitoring things that come in via chat too, so feel free to add comments, ask questions, etc. through chat as well. So with that, let's dive in. And next slide, please, Carrie. As I mentioned earlier, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team is starting a process to determine the need and scope for additional guidance, building on the existing set of corporate greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standards for scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And the objective is to really understand user needs, to identify and address any gaps and align with best practice approaches to really ensure that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standards those three scopes are effective in providing a rigorous and credible accounting foundation for business to measure, plan, and track progress towards science-based and net zero targets in line with the global 1.5 degrees centigrade goal. So in addition to that, one of the focuses will also be to ensure harmonization and alignment with accounting rules under development through major disclosure initiatives, like, with the US Security and Exchange Commission disclosure rules, and the European Commission, and others as well. So the stakeholder process has just kicked off with the release of 4 surveys, and the responses for that are due on February 28th, 2023. And I know the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team anticipates that the stakeholder process is likely to take about 2 years, but that's to be determined. And for context, I guess, on that, the current Scope 2 guidance, which was released in 2015, was developed over a 3-year collaborative process with input from over 200 representatives from companies, utilities, government agencies, academia, industry associations, and others across 23 countries. So one of the things that WRI is doing as well, WRI and WBCSD, who are the 2 organizations that kind of own the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and develop those standards, they are undergoing a strategy to refresh, to determine whether a renewed governance process for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is needed going forward as well. So that's something that's happening in parallel. I know the team had hired a consultant to provide options for moving forward, and leadership across the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team is discussing kind of the developed proposed kind of strategy for that in parallel with opening the surveys. So so that's something that's also unfolding. The next slide, please, Carrie. So essentially, to inform the update process, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is collecting information through 4 surveys, as I'd mentioned. So the first one relates to the corporate accounting and reporting standard. The second one relates to the Scope 2 guidance. The third relates to corporate value chain standard and Scope 3 calculation guidance. And the fourth is actually an initial exploratory survey to gather inputs and perspectives from stakeholders related to market-based accounting approaches. So really, as part of this process, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team plans to kind of holistically examine the appropriateness of market-based accounting methods across sectors, end uses, and scopes. And this process would seek to explore whether market-based accounting is appropriate for Scope 1, Scope 2, and/or Scope 3, and/or project accounting as well. And it would also explore whether the existing accounting approach for Scope 2 would need to be applied, amended, or expanded if it were to be applied outside of Scope 2. So the fourth survey is really an opportunity to collect feedback and understand user needs as an initial step in the process. So whether the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and partners initiatives develop new guidance on this topic will really depend on these survey findings and potential further consultations that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team might run. So just kind of context on what those 4 surveys are. In general, these surveys ask for really high-level input about if and how the Greenhouse Gas Protocol can be updated to improve greenhouse gas accounting, decision-making, and really ensure alignment between ambition and action with global emission reduction needs to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in addition to the surveys, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol also offers an optional proposal template for suggested updates, amendments, and additional guidance. And those proposal templates are also to be used to provide, kind of any empirical or analytical evidence to support those suggested proposals. So those are kind of more long form ways to get inputs in. From CEBI's perspective, we plan to submit comments on the surveys and the 4 proposals in alignment with the 4 recommendations that we're going to be discussing in today's workshop. And we'll be submitting them by the deadline of February 28th. So next slide, please, Carrie. For a little bit of background, again, I know most of you are familiar with this, so I'll just run through this really quickly, but any additional guidance will be developed kind of through kind of an inclusive global multi-stakeholder development process. In terms of the Scope 2 guidance, which is what we're going to be focused on today, I think the important things to note is what the Scope 2 guidance currently includes, and in terms of the Scope 2 guidance, this is for Scope 2 emissions, which by definition are indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with purchase of electricity, steam, heat, or cooling. And the guidance asks companies to report their Scope 2 emissions in two ways. So you have the location-based method and the market-based method. The location-based method reflects the average emissions intensity of grids on which energy consumption occurs. So in other words, it captures the carbon intensity of the grids where a company consumes electricity, so where your consumption occurs. And this method does not consider a company's electricity procurement decisions, though the ultimate location-based inventory is influenced by where a company decides to locate. Location-based estimates rely on using average emissions factors from a broad geographic region. It could be national, and they're usually available from public entities, which allows companies to use common inputs in their calculations. In the United States, companies use EPA's EGRID, average annual emissions factors. The one thing just to note, this method does not consider a company's specific procurement decisions. It essentially shows how GHG intensive a given grid remains. So in general, the portfolio of energy generation resources serving a grid will not necessarily change based on the individual actions of one or more companies, but any shift in the carbon intensity of a grid are only likely to result from kind of aggregated actions and collective decision-making of companies, suppliers, policymakers, and others to kind of shift that grid, the grid mix, essentially. And the market-based method reflects emissions from electricity that companies have purposefully chosen or their lack of choice. So in contrast to the location-based method, the market-based method accounts for a company's decision-making in procuring electricity and enables a company to calculate a reduced Scope 2 inventory by securing contractual instruments that convey lower greenhouse gas emission factors. So using the market-based method, companies really demonstrate reductions in their Scope 2 inventories after executing a variety of transactions for clean energy. There is a specific hierarchy for applying emissions factors that are outlined in this standard as well. And the method essentially uses those emissions factors from contractual instruments, and also kind of attributes and other things. Actually, Carrie, if you hit the slide once, we can show the hierarchy that's included in there. So basically the hierarchy states that companies should first apply energy attribute certificates, recognizing them as a contractual instrument with the highest level of precision in making claims. In the absence of certificates, reporting entities should use the next contractual emission data option in the hierarchy, starting with contracts for power like PPAs, followed by supplier-specific emission rates and residual mixes. And finally, the total absence of contractual instruments. In that case, a company would apply a location-based grid average emission factor. One important note here is that the market-based method does not limit the extent to which companies can rely on unbundled energy attribute certificates to reduce their reported market-based Scope 2 inventory. That means you can buy as many RECs as you like, and the RECs can be applied across grid subnational regions as long as it's within the national market boundary. And obviously it has to matches up to your annual load. So next slide, the release of the current Scope 2 guidance, coincided with significant growth of corporate voluntary procurement and really helped provide the investment certainty needed to expand renewable energy deployment. So it's been foundational to corporate decarbonization strategies, and as a result, energy customers today procure over 1 billion energy attribute certificates annually, creating additional revenue for CFE resources. And in the US, C&I energy customers have driven over 1/3 of all new carbon-free energy capacity additions since 2014. And so it's been very successful, but the current market-based accounting method really incentivizes companies to procure renewable electricity to match historical load on an annual basis. It does not consider timing or location of the carbon-free energy purchase relative to a buyer's consumption, which is an important consideration to accelerate grid decarbonization. So there is emerging consensus that incorporating time and location criteria into the market-based approach will enable energy customers to send more powerful, targeted market signals that drive investments and hasten the deployment of carbon-free energy in the most carbon-intensive locations and times of day. So there is tremendous opportunity to really better leverage energy customers' demand and optimize the impact of voluntary carbon-free electricity procurement to accelerate systemic grid decarbonization. And CEBI, through our Next Gen procurement initiative, has really identified some types of updates necessary across the market system to do this. So I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague Doug now to provide a little bit of context before we dive in. Doug, over to you.
Thank you, Priya. And just to introduce myself, Doug Miller, Deputy Director at Clean Energy Buyers Association and Clean Energy Buyers Institute. So thank you all so much for the time. And just want to, before diving in and setting this broader context for everyone, for how this conversation is fitting into some broader work that we're doing, just want to emphasize the point too from Priya's presentation that CEBI will be developing responses to these different surveys and submitting four separate types of proposals using the templates that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides, in line with a lot of the discussion we'll be having today. But before diving into some more of the heart of the discussion, for those who are not familiar with the work that the Clean Energy Buyers Institute has been doing this year around what we call the Next Gen Initiative, I'll start with just some comments about this and a lot of the insights we've developed over the past few months. So we launched the Next Gen Initiative earlier this year, and at the core of this initiative is an ambition to expand the menu of available carbon-free electricity procurement options that are at the disposal of customers. In other words, we want to create a larger menu of procurement options so customers can go even further with their procurement and send more targeted and powerful market signals. Our theory of change is that in order to help customers achieve their objectives for next generation procurement, which I'll go into in a second, there are 4 types of evolutions or updates that have to happen in the voluntary market system. So first, we need enriched energy attribute certificates that contain more attributes. In other words, we need to capture more types of data on EACs to allow for more differentiated CFE products. To support these new attributes on the EAC, we need more consistent and more granular data. Then, to help motivate more ambition among customers, we need either updated leadership programs or new leadership programs that motivate customers to pursue next generation objectives. And then lastly, we need some clarification and gap filling in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to clarify how customers can account for these next generation objectives. Next slide, please. So we put ourselves in the shoes of customers as a starting point in this journey for the Next Gen Initiative to essentially figure out what exactly do customers want to do to drive greater impact that they cannot do right now in a consistent, standardized way. And during this research process, we surveyed numerous customers and have built out user stories for each of the following. And all of these are detailed further in a guide that I'll be giving more information on in a second. But here are the 8 top next generation objectives that customers share with us that they're looking to do. And just to summarize them very briefly, we've heard from customers that there's a lot of interest in procuring any carbon-free electricity resource, including complementary technologies that can together help promote systemic grid decarbonization. There's interest in matching procurement with load curves. In other words, this idea of 24/7 time-matched procurement. There's interest among customers both to procure carbon-free electricity in those locations that are most carbon intensive and or the times of day or seasons that are most carbon intensive. There's interest among customers to procure carbon-free electricity to cover value chains, meaning customer supplier networks, as well as the downstream use of the product or service. There's interest in making it easier for customers to over-procure carbon-free electricity in certain places where they have load, while they're waiting to make more options available in other more challenging locations. In other words, open up options in parallel to local policy engagement to expand local options. There's interest in customers who are engaging with policymakers and regulators to get more recognition for when they drive essentially decisions that affect the entire grid and not just their own company's actions and operations. And then lastly, there's greater interest in establishing the social and community credentials that can be attached to renewable energy, carbon-free electricity procurement, meaning, for example, community decision-making processes, evaluations of ecosystem impacts, evaluations of local job numbers that are created, et cetera, that could be attached to the EAC and inform decision-making among customers. Next slide, please. So if the customer objective started as the initial point for our research, we then essentially work to figure out what will it actually take to activate these types of procurement options. And so if our end goal is to expand the CFE procurement menu so that customers can have more options at their disposal and send more targeted, powerful signals, essentially thinking about it more as sending market signals to create a dart where you can really pinprick the impacts you want to have. It became clear that there are 4 types of evolutions needed, which allude to the points I brought up earlier. So first, our research finds that we need 5 new types of energy attribute certificate attributes, or we need to capture a couple more attributes on the EAC. And these include a couple of things. For example, creating tags for all complementary and all carbon-free electricity generation resources, creating tags for storage-related events, creating tags for social and community credentials, creating an hourly timestamp, and attaching an average grid carbon intensity number to enable procurement at those most carbon-intensive locations and times in a verifiable way. Related to this, we know we need more granular and consistent data, and that this is essential to make it possible for EAC issuing bodies to not only introduce new attributes on the EAC, but fill those attributes in with a consistent set of granular data that meet the needs of customers. We know that we need an evolved set of leadership programs and communities of customers that are pursuing next generation objectives together. And so we in this guide, we define opportunities for leadership programs to either update their existing program or create new ones that ultimately map toward each of these 8 next generation options and objectives. And then lastly, and this is of course the heart of the matter today, there are specific areas of the greenhouse gas protocol where we think there is a need, at the very least, for some clarification and certainly some gap filling to help activate the next generation options. And just for everyone's benefit, I will put in the chat a link to a blog that overviews the guide, which goes really into the couple of the points I just shared in much greater depth. And you can find links to the full guide in this blog I just added a link to. Next slide, please. So for this last pillar around greenhouse gas accounting, we know that this is a topic that's extremely important. And so we've set aside various workshops over the past year tackling this topic specifically among a diverse set of stakeholders whom we call activators, and that includes a set of energy customers, solution providers, and various market system stakeholders ranging from the EAC registries and leadership program to those who do a lot of thinking and research about greenhouse gas accounting. And so I'm not going to go through all these points in detail. It's really just the point of this slide is to show the sheer amount of dialogues and convenings that we've had over the past few months to gather input and help us establish both our principles and initial recommendations for what will go into the our own greenhouse gas protocol submissions, and may very well inform some of your own submissions. Something I'd like to highlight is that as I said, we have had a diverse representation in our convenings, and at this point, it's over 150 organizations have engaged. I'm sure after today's call, that number has ticked even higher. So it's been absolutely great to see the level of engagement on this topic. And obviously now that the protocol has opened up the new updates process, now is the time to really come up with strong recommendations for how we can make it all work even better than it already does. So the first thing we want to highlight on this, on the CEBI side, are three core principles for how we're approaching the recommendations for ways to enhance the greenhouse gas protocol. So I will go through these first before going on to what our recommendations actually are. And these guiding principles are important because they shape the tone and the frame of the recommendations that we currently are landing on. And so our first principle, and this will come as no surprise to folks who've been engaging with us over the past few months, we think CEBI's recommendation should help expand the availability of carbon-free electricity procurement options for customers rather than narrow them. In other words, let's expand the menu, create more choice for impact. And then building on that and related to that is the second principle. We think that the updates to the greenhouse gas protocol should encourage greater ambition without limiting options. So point one is expand the menu, yet at the same time, motivate higher action. Recognizing that energy customers are at different points in their own learning journey for how to navigate these markets. They all have different levels of resources, and not all of them necessarily can or want to be energy experts. And so we should recognize that diversity, not just in the US and Europe, but including across geographic diversities in the developing world and the markets there that are just getting off the ground. The third principle is that we should recognize that the carbon-free electricity markets are critical to broader decarbonization goals as a society. And it's one of the areas where we have seen a lot of momentum, and we should build on that momentum, recognizing that voluntary markets are very much enmeshed with policy, the acts of policymakers. And so voluntary action really can be seen and should be seen as complementary to all the important work of policymakers and regulators. And so we think that the updates to the process should really continue to build on this momentum and certainly not do anything that could chill or slow the momentum that we've been seeing. So this slide and the next one, we will spend a lot of time on, so you don't feel like you have to rush to read this. I will first introduce this first set of recommendations that will go into the first of 4 planned comments that CEBI will be submitting to the greenhouse gas protocol. We'll have a little bit of time for discussion, and then we will just have a quick pulse check poll. We'll then do the same for recommendations 2, 3, and 4 on the next slide before we move toward wrapping up in about 25 minutes. So for this first area, I will go through this line by line just as people are digesting, and then I'll open up for a little bit of discussion. So first, CEBI recommends that the greenhouse gas protocol should maintain the market-based method under scope 2. So I'll just emphasize that point. We at CEBI think that the market-based method is critical, that it forms an essential part of voluntary markets and the investments we've seen unlocked over the past decade. That being said, we also see opportunities to further improve the market-based method under scope 2. And so first, we think that there should be additional guidance that helps clarify and provide locational and temporal data in terms of the hierarchy, covering topics such as electricity consumption data, how to treat emission factors in existing hierarchy, and then the third point here, which is perhaps the newest consideration that was gathered this year, which is the role of granular certificates, which are known as hourly timestamp certificates, that they should perhaps be treated as the highest precision EAC within the EAC hierarchy, within the emission factor hierarchy, for a number of reasons, but that all EACs should be overall at the top of the hierarchy itself. We think that the language should be clarified and, if needed, broadened to promote tech neutrality in terms of the treatment of carbon-free electricity generation and complementary technologies. In other words, if there's a generation resource and or complementary technology that supports the decarbonization of the grid, it should be clear that that counts within the market-based method. We think that there is a notable gap in terms of the treatment of particularly storage as a complementary technology, including clean hydrogen, and that this is something that there should be a lot of time and attention spent on. And then one that at this stage is the least clear in terms of how best to proceed is this idea of how to treat essentially the state of grid supplied carbon-free electricity and actions the utility takes along with purchases that customers make. And so for each of these parts of our first set of recommendations, there are a couple of next steps that I just want to flag. So on this overall point of the importance of market-based accounting and the role of market instruments, namely the energy attribute certificate, we are in the process of finalizing and soon distributing some 2-page explainers that we will share with diverse stakeholders, including those of you on the line, that detail why these markets matter and asking folks to essentially submit your own case studies, examples, evidence, and so on as part of the greenhouse gas protocol process. We're also engaged in various research by our peers at other organizations like the Center for Resource Solutions to further elevate and clarify the impact of voluntary markets to date. We're also, in terms of these the subsets of this recommendation, we are drafting more detailed tables and recommended updates to the protocol in line with each of these points. And then for the points that maybe remain a bit more open at this stage, we'll be having some more conversations with folks early in the new year. So with that, I'll open up for questions or comments that folks may want to offer, and recognize we don't have a lot of time. We'll ask folks to keep your comments brief, and we will move to a poll in roughly 5 minutes. So curious to hear any thoughts that folks might have on this first recommendation. I'm sure folks have a lot of thoughts about a couple of these points, so don't hesitate.
Hi, Doug. This is Laura Zapata with Clear Loop. I have a question about 1A. You mentioned 1AC. in the granularity certificates, you said that CEBI is going to be recommending that time of day stamp, it has a higher hierarchy than, or is higher in the hierarchy than the emissions factor. Is that right?
So our thinking is that yes, but I want to clarify. So yes, that in terms of precision, a granular certificate, of course, is the most precise instrument, but that it still should be within the overall band of EACs. So in other words, if there's an option to make use of a granular certificate, which of course it's not yet, EAC registries don't yet have granular certificates adopted or implemented, that if you can, that would be the most granular or precise instrument available. That's not saying that it's not saying that one should necessarily go for that. It's just saying that that is the most precise instrument in terms of understanding the procurement.
And the one thing I'll just add to that, Doug, to what you raised, is that, again, I mean, these are just kind of some additional suggestions. We haven't said like this is like the end all in terms of like what the hierarchy should be. It's just, I guess the broader point there is that, kind of being able to capture kind of the time and location piece in a more credible way is what is something that would be valued. And so this is a potential suggestion to do that in a more granular fashion. So I think that I just wanted to add that. And I know Henry has his hand up as well.
I just had a quick question. We've been hearing consistently from WRI and other players in the market that they're getting a lot of criticism about the market-based approach. And that one of the primary criticisms is that it does the EACs are not guaranteeing investment in renewables in the way that they're expected to. I think there have been a couple news reports recently to this effect. Do you think that these proposals substantially address those criticisms?
So we have more, there are a couple more recommendations to go through, Henry. Thanks for the question. I mean, first and foremost, we think that the framing of some of those recent articles are a bit misleading, and that from our perspective, voluntary markets are enabling billions of additional capital that would not otherwise have been invested, and is providing very, very easy to measure dollars that are added to the revenue stack, for example. And at the same time, so saying this another way, we think that voluntary markets have been essential in driving investments in carbon-free electricity generation resources over the past decade. We think that the system can be improved by enabling next generation procurement. So what I mean by that is by enhancing the EAC so that we can activate new types of procurement options so that customers can send even more targeted signals with their procurement. That will enable customers to do more. But at the same time, were these options to be eliminated or diminished, that would have potentially a very negative effect on investments going into this space. I realize there's a lot to unpack, both probably more with what you said, Henry, and maybe some of my comments too. But in respect of time, I just want to maybe quickly ask if there are other thoughts or questions before we do a quick poll and move on to the next ones. Neil, I see your hand.
Yeah, no, this is great. I guess one thing I just thinking about, you say you want to maintain market-based scope 2 and make these updates. It would be helpful. I mean, one of the things I think we're all struggling with is transparency about what is it we're actually measuring in and want to measure in scope 2 market-based accounting, and talking about being really transparent about what we're measuring. And then once you tell me what we're measuring, we can talk about accuracy and how to improve accuracy. And if you say this is really designed to improve and measure emissions associated with electricity use, and this is the way we make it more accurate, then that's one thing. If we're trying to measure the emissions reductions, that would maybe that's a different thing, and there's a different way to measure that. And so I think you probably have recommendations related, based on the 8 things that you said people want to do, and you want to give people options. I think there are different ways to accurately measure each of those 2 different questions. And so I think it would be helpful to just be really transparent about and say, what are you trying to do here?
Absolutely. So I mean, market-based accounting is assessing procurement. So it's your procurement of the carbon-free electrons on the grid. And of course, that then creates the essential additional revenue that these projects would not otherwise receive. And so just seeing 1 or 2 questions in the thread. If, for example, this past year, there were roughly a billion EACs purchased in voluntary markets, that's you can take estimates about the average price. Some of the research we've seen is roughly 10 billion of additional revenue, for example, that went to these markets from this type of voluntary procurement. So we think that's real and impactful. And of course, at the same time, what we're suggesting is that, and almost maybe to call it out for what it is, we of course want customers to support more CFE procurement in the places and times that are the most carbon intensive. We don't necessarily need more procurement of and more investment in solar in California or Spain, or more wind in Texas or the Netherlands or UK. And so we think that by making it possible for customers to discover, purchase, and verify their procurement of these more targeted options, that then it becomes possible to also make an evidence-based claim about the impact you're having, where this impact you're having is procurement. And then together, the goal here is to change the system, which is the grid, through this pool of funding enabled by the collective efforts of energy customers globally. So that's a little bit of a way to answer that, Neil, and 1 or 2 of the questions in here. And thanks, Kelly. I think I maybe hit a couple of those. Recognizing the time, I'm going to suggest we open up for a quick pulse check poll before we go to the next slide and the other recommendations. And so the request here is to provide your initial reactions for parts 1A, 1B, 1C. There's no right answer. We're doing this just a way to assess people's reactions.
Hey, Doug, we're having a little bit of an issue getting the poll to launch. Give me 1 sec.
Oh, I see it on my screen, for what it's worth.
Okay, never mind. I didn't say a thing.
Give folks another maybe 20 seconds. One other thing while we wrap up this poll, there are part of the challenge to address the point is this, how do you prove the impact that this industry is having? There wasn't at the outset a way to evaluate those metrics. And so there is generally a call to action among folks to start publishing the case studies, examples, and statistics. But there is some, for what it's worth, interesting work that's emerging on one end by institutions like Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, which is showing really the interwoven nature of voluntary procurement, how that's enabling policy action, and how the policy action is also critical to getting customers on board. So I can add that link. And then there's also groups like Soul Systems and others who are publishing how these market instruments are impacting their revenues and helps them ultimately invest in more renewables, for example. So we're encouraging as many folks as possible to share this data, which historically might be seen as proprietary. But we think it's an important enough situation to hopefully get folks to publish a little bit of this information. So given the time, I see the poll results, very interesting. Seems like there's general support for these points, which we weren't sure what the reaction would be. So this is overall good to see. It means we're on the right track, I think. So let's end this poll, Carrie, and then move on to the next slide, please. Great. Well, the last substantive slide here before we go to the wrap up is the second, third, and fourth recommendations. I'll go through these quickly given time. So recommendation 2 is this point that Henry, you were getting at. So we think it's important to assess that the greenhouse gas protocol assesses the pros and cons of adding a required third number, where this number would investigate, and I'll put this in air quotes because there's lots of meanings that people attach to this word, but that assesses avoided carbon emissions impact. So essentially, if our goal is to send those market signals and investments in more carbon-free electricity in those places and times that are most carbon intensive, we would want that number to clarify when an organization or energy customer in fact did procure CFE, mapping toward that indicator. And so on this point, we'll have some more conversations early in the year to further build out this recommendation and what it might look like. But essentially the top line is that we think this topic needs to be explored further. There's no clear immediate answer yet. We have a couple of ideas, again, that we'll build out further in our recommendation to the greenhouse gas protocol. The third recommendation we have is around scope 3. And so the point here is that we at CEBI think that the market-based method should be extended to scope 3. Of course, just like how we want to promote next generation procurement for scope 2, we'd want there to be the same tools and potentially incentives, of course, for customers who are procuring CFE on behalf of their value chain partners, either or both upstream and downstream, that it's clear in the protocol how to do this and how to account for it. And so on this point, we're also engaged in collaborations with our peers like CRS to develop more research on what's needed to make this possible from an accounting perspective. But we think this is an area that will unlock a lot more demand. And we think unlocking more demand will also have an important and clear impact on voluntary markets and investments in grid decarbonization. The last recommendation is more of a process point. So we have a general recommendation to the greenhouse gas protocol that moving forward, the updates process does not necessarily operate like it is right now, that like software updates, that we will encourage the greenhouse gas protocol to have more targeted and frequent updates that meet the evolving and market developments and needs that happen, and one that's a bit more streamlined. I think we all know that this process is going to take a lot of time, attention, and resources, and we of course want to get it right. And we'd invite ways to make the process a bit more streamlined in the future. And so there's some ideas we have that we'll also be sharing as part of our this separate recommendation to the protocol. With that, curious if there are any brief comments or questions over the next few minutes. Then we'll have a poll in about 5.
And I would just want to say a reminder that partly what we're trying to achieve in this workshop is just familiarity and alignment on the top line concepts in each of these recommendations. Obviously, the next step is to go build this out in more detailed description and recommendations. So really the objective here is to make sure that everybody's aligned on the concepts in each of these recommendations.
Thanks, Bryn. Simone?
Yeah, hi, Doug. Thanks a lot for it's Simone from FlexiDAO. Thanks a lot for sharing this. Very insightful. I had a general question and comment on the overall strategy. So what you said before the recommendations, and this comment comes from two considerations. One, that what is asked to the greenhouse gas protocol is also to increase the comparability, both of scope 2 and scope 3, thinking that both the European Union and the US will transition to mandatory carbon reporting. And indeed, related to Henry's comment on the criticism towards additionality and the actual impact of the current system. So I don't necessarily understand, or I think in order to have a better response to WRI that addresses the criticism, how is making the menu larger address these two criticisms? Because if you give more options, you decrease comparability, because you're kind of spreading across in more buckets what companies can report, so it will be harder to compare. At the same time, it's true you are incentivizing demand, but you're also diversifying demand, which then could give more options to buyers to go and look for the cheaper option, not necessarily the more impactful option.
Mm-hmm.
And considering that market base is currently being attacked, yeah, I think it would be helpful to understand how making the menu bigger addresses these criticisms.
Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, it's all good questions. So our theory here is that first and foremost, we need to continue to increase demand. To put it another way, there is not yet enough voluntary demand in the market. And so we need to have an on-ramp for very straightforward purchases and processes that reduce all behavioral and practical barriers for companies of all sizes and stripes to engage in these markets globally, not just the US or Europe, and including emerging markets in different IREC countries, for example. And so part one is we need to continue to grow the base of demand and have those options that anyone can engage in and realistically engage in, while at the same time, I hear your point, not wanting to spread things too thinly or create these inconsistencies. Our recommendation is that we need to have options that allow for that pinpricking of impact and sending those very specific market signals for resources at certain times or places, so that the revenues start going more toward those times or places and unlock more investments there. And we think that we've solved for this consistency issue because all procurement must revolve around the EAC, which is, of course, an ex post fact-based instrument about completed procurement. And so we think that by adding these new attributes to the EAC, we can enable more folks like FlexiDAO, your firm, to develop these options where customers can decide to procure it. They have the evidence they need to report what they've done to in their greenhouse gas accounting. And if, for example, in the case of what FlexiDAO does, there's interest in an hourly matched solution, then they will send those market signals for those times of day where the customer's consuming electricity for more CFE at those times. It might be that in a different geography or for a different company, their approach is different. And so for us, we want to enable all of the options, essentially grow the pool and send more laser focused market signals with the procurement, all in a way that's verifiable, so that we can avoid greenwashing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and just for a clarification, I didn't want to lead this to an emissionality or 24/7 discussion.
Oh, no,
not at all. Really,
we think we can have
like
both.
more as a. Yeah, but the thing is that having both, my fear and concern is that actually weakens the response to the criticism towards market-based.
Mm.
That's a bit the concern. So that by not agreeing, we are weakening our own position towards the criticism that we are receiving. because the criticism are quite clear. And this is essentially my concern, that increasing the option, as it is explained right now, I don't necessarily understand how it addresses the criticism with what WRI is asking, which is in the end fact database, also hopefully proven by academics, that indeed these proposals address the concerns and criticisms received.
Yeah,
it was just again an open, like I think we all share the willingness of safeguarding market base. It was just an open question if this is the most efficient way of doing that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the comment, Simone. Recognizing the time, let's open up the poll for a pulse check on these 3 recommendations. So similar as the last one, but it'll be recommendations 2, 3, and 4. So that should be coming up momentarily, and then we will move toward, I see the poll now, thanks, Carrie. And then we will move to wrap up on our own next steps with Priya once we close the poll. Let's give folks another 20 seconds or so. Ten more seconds. Get it to 1 minute. All right. Thanks for that, Carrie. We can move on to the last slide. And Priya, it's all you.
Great. I know we just scratched the surface on this. Again, we do plan to have more workshops to discuss these ideas. This was just to kind of give a sense of where our recommendations were at this point, and based on the input that we've received through the workshops we've had to date. So we do plan to solicit feedback from all of you as well, and insights, and have some additional, at least 1 or 2 more workshops on this. And you feel free to reach out to my colleague Carrie Metz to provide kind of any input at this stage. And then we are planning, as Doug had mentioned, to also have to put out some pieces around kind of what we've gathered in terms of conversations we've had as well with members of CEBA and others in aggregate around kind of the value that some of these the market-based accounting approach has provided. Again, it's a lot of anecdotal evidence, but that's something that we plan to do. I think the call to action is really for everyone to provide feedback. I know Michael McRae and David Rich from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team are on today's call as well, and they're really looking for quality feedback and thoughtful feedback from all of you. So definitely submit responses to the survey. I think also in terms of a lot of the questions that were asked today are questions that we're all grappling with as an industry. So in terms of research and findings and other things, I think it's important to call that out. Thanks, Suzanne, for calling out some of what Soul Systems has been working on as well. So I think in terms of just general education and understanding across what everyone is doing, I think that's going to be really important moving forward. I know we are at time, so I just want to flag finally that we do actually, unrelated to this, we do have a webinar scheduled. We will follow up with this, but we do have a webinar scheduled on Thursday as well, as an educational webinar on opportunities, challenges, and the importance of new market frameworks for deploying clean hydrogen as well. So if you have not registered and are interested, please join us for that. You can find the registration information on the website and you know on the CEBA website. And we can, in terms of the pool results, we can definitely share those in aggregate as well. So we can post those. I think, wait, there we go. I see them now. And in terms of slides, we can definitely share these general slides. Again, these are just draft. This is not, you know, this is not our final submission. So just, you know, not to be kind of circulated broadly, but we can definitely share that. Thank you everyone for joining us. I know this was very rushed towards the end, but we appreciate this and look forward to having more conversations with all of you on these topics.